The first Labor Day in the United States was in 1882, and it really was, it had a dual purpose. First of all, was to honor those who worked, but it also was a statement about the value of the worker. The economy in the United States at the time was very strong, but it was built on the backs of labor that really had no, across the board, no comprehensive protections, regulations, anything that would really protect the laborer. And so most people at that time were working 12-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week. Some communities, they were off on Sundays, but some communities not. And there was nothing to regulate any of that stuff. 12-hour days were commonplace. There was no age limit or age restriction on the worker. And so children worked 12-hour days alongside their parents or other adults. There were no wage regulations. There was no such thing as a minimum wage. The wage that was given was the wage that the employer decided on. There was no such thing as sick days. There was no health insurance. There was no retirement fund, no pensions, no nothing. None of that existed in 1882. And quite honestly, it didn't exist for quite some time. By 1894, there was a proposal that one day be set aside to honor the laborer. And quite honestly, it was a political ploy. The economy was not strong at that point. Laborers were resistant to some of the requirements that businesses had. The Pullman workers went on strike. President Cleveland sent 12,000 federal troops to push them back into working, to get the railroads running again. 13 strikers were killed by federal troops. Grover Cleveland wanted to run for a third term, and so there was this proposal in Congress that got ushered through Congress for a Labor Day, and he thought, well, if I sign this into place and give them a day off during the year, that will appease them. And so he signed into law Labor Day. Not a very stellar beginning for this civic holiday that we have. It didn't help Grover Cleveland, by the way. He lost the Democratic nomination for presidency. It just was a political ploy that failed. Labor didn't improve very much for a while. And, you know, I know that for many people, the word union is verboten. We don't like to hear about unions sometimes. We don't like to hear about labor unions. But I have to say, there were smaller unions that tried to regulate what they were going to do for the employees that worked for companies. And it wasn't until they combined those smaller unions into the AFL that those smaller unions had a more powerful voice. And then all of a sudden, they were able, through their work, their lobbying, and all the rest of it, to put into effect all those things that I just talked about that were missing. They worked on things like hours of work, hours that children could work, hours of the week that adults could work, minimum wages, and you can go right on down the list of everything that we have today. Everything that we have today, whether you were a union worker or not, came from the unions. Whether you were a union worker or not. Everything that we have in law that regulates employment came from the unions. People back after the Second World War, when they looked at laborers at that point, thought that they had soft and cushy jobs. What? 5 days a week? 40 hours a week? You lazy slugs. You ain't doing nothing. You know, it's that same old thing that we hear today. When I was a kid, I worked 18 hours a day and walked uphill to work in the snow both ways and got 2 cents an hour. No, always resistant to that kind of change based on what we in our own generation experience. The 5-day, 40-hour work week became pretty commonplace. Minimum wage became pretty commonplace. You go right on down the list of those things. And they became the norm. Even though a generation before those norms took place thought that they were a destructive norm and would destroy the economy. We exist in a similar kind of experience today. I can tell you pretty clearly that the experience people have had with work during this pandemic is going to change the face of work. And we older people are going to be put off by it. Because we're accustomed to the way it is, and we're accustomed to the convenience of it. We're accustomed to the prices of it. There is something progressive about these things that is a natural progression. I can't tell you what to think about laborers and workers. I know that some of you already think that the people who work today are lazy and ignorant people. I know you think that already. You've already told me that. But it's a different generation, and there will be a different attitude toward work. There will be a different way of working, whether we like it or not. Much as our ancestors hated the way it changed for them. But work will continue. There will always be this tension between the equity of the work that's given out, the requirements of the work that are to be done, and the compensation that people will receive. What's happening today is that more and more people are exchanging, are not looking for more money, they're exchanging it for time. They want more time with their families, they want more leisure time, and that's the biggest conflict that we're experiencing today. People during the pandemic discovered that they could wed their stay-at-home work with their work and their leisure time. And quite honestly, in most industries, it didn't affect productivity all that much. I mean, in some of the labor industries, yes, where you had to be on site to do things, but the big discovery has been that not everybody needs to be on site to do things. I'll give you an example. My sister-in-law works for an insurance company. And everybody was sent home during the pandemic, and productivity increased. People were working from home, and their productivity increased. The owner of the company didn't like that people were at home, and so forced them to come back before it was safe to come back. People, of course, got COVID and all that stuff, and they started missing work. And productivity decreased. And productivity, even today, with the in-office workers, is slightly lower than when people were working from home. It's an astonishing kind of thing. But if that's going to be the case for places like that, it's probably going to be the case for many, many different professions. As I say, you'll probably look at that and say, well, you know, they're a bunch of lazy bums. But work is a value. Work is a value that individuals have, we all have. There's this intrinsic desire, fundamentally an intrinsic desire to work. We may not like the work that we do. That's part of the problem. You know, I did some coursework in business. When I went to get my doctorate in ministry, my work was in administration, church administration. And one of the interesting things I heard is that there's never really a bad worker. There's a bad job for the worker. And not everybody winds up where they're supposed to wind up. That most people, given the right job, will do good work. But unfortunately, what happens is many people, because of all kinds of circumstances, get plugged into jobs that aren't a good fit for them. Now, we can debate that, and certainly it's been an issue that's been debated, but I think there's probably some truth to that. Because there is this intrinsic desire for us to work, to do something productive. For the Christian, it is also intrinsic that we do those things to help to build the kingdom of God. We look for our gift, our talent, whatever God has given us, and we look for the way to utilize that to build God's kingdom. It's part of the desire of the Christian. It's not only a desire on a person to work, but on the desire of a Christian to have meaningful work, purposeful work, where they can build the kingdom of God. And so for some Christians, they may do something that isn't particularly rewarding, and yet it's an opportunity to engage people in communication about the kingdom of God. It's an opportunity to engage people in a reflection about the kingdom of God and what it means for us to help to build the kingdom of God. Work is an essential thing for us. It's going to take on different structures. It's going to take on different faces. It's going to change over the years. It's going to mean something to one generation that it doesn't mean to another generation. Just because those things are changing does not mean that the element of work isn't important to people. It's a kind of important thing. And the reason I say this here is because we are all, most of us, older people. And older people, they have a sense of what's right and wrong based on their experience. But things change. Things change. So just because it's not what you saw it or the way you lived it, doesn't mean that it isn't important to another generation. They're finding the way to do their work in a meaningful way, in a purposeful way, and in a healthy way. And hopefully those who embrace Christianity are finding a way to do it in such a way that helps to build the kingdom of God.